The spring of 1942 was a moment when the world felt as if it was turning upside down. In Asia and the Pacific, the Japanese Empire was carving a path of victory so rapid and so shocking that even seasoned commanders struggled to comprehend how quickly the balance of power had changed. Just 1 week earlier, the fall of the Bataan Peninsula had stunned the Allies. For 3 grueling months, the American and Filipino defenders, later known as the Battling Bastards, had held off a massive Japanese invasion force with almost no food, no medicine, and no hope of reinforcement. Their collapse, though tragic, was not a failure of courage, but a sign of how overstretched the Allied defenses had become. Japan, confident and unstoppable, now controlled the gateway to Manila Bay and began to look south toward the remaining islands of the Philippines. At the same time, another shadow loomed over the Indian Ocean, where Japanese raids against British naval bases left London deeply worried about a potential invasion of Ceylon. In the span of just 4 months, Japan had struck Pearl Harbor, overran Malaya and Singapore, crushed the Dutch East Indies, and seized critical positions in the Pacific. Every move they made seemed calculated, coordinated, and devastatingly effective. Yet, as the Japanese expanded, their enemies were not entirely silent. This particular week, the one that would later echo across military history, was the moment the United States planned to strike back in a way that no one in Tokyo imagined possible. Before that, however, the fighting across the Philippines continued with relentless intensity. General Masaharu Homma, commander of Japanese forces in the islands, now turned his attention toward the Visayas and Mindanao. For months, he had lacked the manpower to launch simultaneous operations across the entire archipelago. But with Bataan now in Japanese hands, he was free to begin a sweeping advance into the southern islands. Reinforcements from Borneo and Malaya, battle-hardened units known as the Kawaguchi and Kawamura detachments, arrived to spearhead this new offensive. Homma believed that capturing Cebu and Panay would crack open the final defenses of the southern Philippines and pave the way for the conquest of Mindanao. His opponents, unfortunately, were in no state to resist a coordinated assault. General William Sharp commanded 3 under-equipped Filipino divisions in Mindanao, most lacking proper artillery or training. His mission was to protect key airfields and maintain organized resistance as long as possible. But in reality, he knew that if his defenses collapsed, his only viable strategy would be to dissolve into the mountains and wage guerrilla war. Further north, General Bradford Chynoweth held the Visayas with about 20,000 Filipino troops spread thinly across several islands. His forces were brave but poorly armed, and though they had spent the last month preparing elaborate defenses on Cebu and Panay, they stood little chance against seasoned Japanese veterans. On April 9th, soon after Bataan fell, Chynoweth received warning of Japanese convoys approaching Cebu. Throughout the night, Japanese ships split into 2 groups, one heading toward the eastern beaches near Cebu City, the other toward the port of Toledo. By sunrise, both groups began their landings. The defenders fought hard, but were quickly overwhelmed. Within just 24 hours, Cebu City was in Japanese hands, though the Filipinos managed to sabotage critical structures before pulling back into the island's rugged interior. Toledo fell soon after, and with their key positions lost, the remaining defenders had no choice but to retreat deep into the mountains, preparing for a long guerrilla war. As Cebu collapsed, Panay became the next target. On April 16th, Japanese troops landed unopposed at Iloilo and advanced rapidly, seizing key towns in just days. Colonel Albert Christie, knowing that fighting in the open would lead to slaughter, withdrew his troops into the mountains to preserve them for guerrilla operations. In this moment, formal resistance in the Visayas effectively ended, while Japanese control across the region tightened. These losses opened the door for Homma's ultimate goal, the invasion of Mindanao, the last major defensive stronghold in the Philippines. While the Japanese pushed deeper into the islands, their forces also advanced across the Dutch East Indies. The capture of Java in early March had shattered organized resistance, but pockets of Dutch troops still operated in remote areas, especially in New Guinea. A Japanese naval unit of about 1,500 men set out to clear these remaining outposts, landing in multiple locations with almost no opposition. Town after town, Bwela, Fakfak, Babo, Sorong, and Manokwari fell with barely a fight. The Dutch defenders retreated into the interior, hoping the harsh terrain would slow the Japanese advance. By late April, Japan effectively controlled Dutch New Guinea, setting the stage for future operations aimed at isolating Australia. Yet, even as Japan expanded rapidly, a major problem simmered beneath the surface: a lack of cooperation between its two main enemies, the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy. After the fall of the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command, the Pacific theater was divided between General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific and Admiral Chester Nimitz in the Central Pacific. These two commanders often disagreed, arguing over resources, priorities, and strategy. Their rivalry would shape much of the early war. However, this particular week marked the first major operation that required direct cooperation between both branches, and the result would become one of the most daring missions in American military history. By April 1942, the Japanese were convinced that their homeland was beyond the reach of American attack. Their fleet guarded the Pacific aggressively, and their air defenses were positioned primarily to protect territory they had recently conquered. Tokyo itself felt untouchable. This confidence would prove to be a monumental miscalculation. In Washington, Admiral Ernest King authorized a plan that would strike directly at the heart of Japan. The idea was bold and dangerous: launch land-based B-25 bombers from an aircraft carrier, a tactic never before attempted. Two naval officers, Francis Lowe and Donald Duncan, developed the plan, calculating that with modifications to reduce weight and extend fuel capacity, the bombers could launch from a carrier deck, hit major Japanese cities, then continue toward friendly airfields in China. General Joseph Stilwell negotiated with Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek to secure the landing sites needed for the returning bombers. Chiang hesitated, knowing that hosting American aircraft would provoke severe Japanese retaliation, but in the end he agreed, setting the stage for the audacious raid that would soon follow. The mission would be carried out by 16 modified B-25B bombers under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. They were loaded onto the carrier USS Hornet, while Admiral Halsey's Task Force 16 provided escort. Their target, Tokyo. As Task Force 16 and the USS Hornet pushed across the cold waters of the North Pacific, every man on board understood that this mission was unlike anything attempted before. The B-25 bombers sitting on the carrier's deck looked oversized, almost out of place beside the sleek naval aircraft normally stationed there. These bombers had trained extensively on land, practicing extremely short takeoffs to mimic the tight space of a carrier deck, but none of the pilots truly knew whether such a launch would work in real combat conditions. The mood aboard the Hornet was tense, yet electric. Every sailor understood that something extraordinary was about to happen, an attack that might restore the shaken morale of a nation still recovering from Pearl Harbor's devastation. Meanwhile, the Japanese High Command remained convinced that the United States was months, if not years, away from mounting any real offensive action. In Tokyo, government officials and military leaders were celebrating their rapid victories across Asia, believing that their defensive perimeter was strong enough to prevent any enemy fleet from approaching undetected. Their air defenses were focused on protecting the newly occupied territories, not the home islands. A few naval officers voiced concerns about the vulnerability of Japan's coastline, especially with American carriers still unaccounted for, but their warnings were dismissed. It was simply unthinkable that the Americans could strike Tokyo while the Imperial Navy reigned supreme in the Pacific. On April 13th, Admiral Halsey's force met up with the Hornet in the vast, empty expanse of the ocean. Together, they raced westward at high speed. The sea was rough, and waves crashed over the bow, but the fleet pushed on. Every hour brought them closer to Japanese waters and closer to danger. The operation required absolute secrecy. If the Japanese detected the American force too early, the entire mission would collapse, and the loss of even one carrier island would be a disaster for the still crippled U.S. Navy. Yet, ironically, secrecy would soon become the first challenge the Americans failed to maintain. Shortly after dawn on April 18th, one of Japan's picket boats spotted the American fleet. These small vessels formed the perimeter far from the Japanese coast, serving as an early warning system. The ship that spotted them, Nitomaru, quickly radioed a warning, though American planes launched from the Hornet and the cruiser Nashville tried to destroy it before it could transmit. Despite American efforts, the message got through.
Halsey had no choice. The mission had to launch immediately, even though the fleet was nearly 170 nautical miles farther from Japan than planned. This meant the bombers would likely not have enough fuel to reach the Chinese airfields. But Doolittle and his men made the decision without hesitation. They would attempt the flight anyway. At 8:20 in the morning, James Doolittle climbed into his bomber, checked the modified fuel gauges, and prepared for takeoff. The Hornet's deck pitched violently with the waves, making the task even more dangerous. Dozens of sailors lined the deck, silently praying for the first aircraft to rise into the air. If Doolittle failed, the mission would be over before it began. Engines roared, the bomber lurched forward, and for a brief second it seemed impossible that such a large aircraft could clear the bow. But then, with perfect timing and expert skill, the B-25 lifted into the sky. Cheers erupted across the flight deck. One by one, the remaining 15 bombers followed, each takeoff a breathtaking gamble against the cold wind. As the American planes raced westward towards Japan, they maintained radio silence. Flying low over the water to avoid detection, the crews stared ahead with a mixture of nerves and determination. They knew the mission was as symbolic as it was strategic, the first strike against the Japanese homeland since the war began. For many Americans back home, this raid would represent a form of justice, a demonstration that the United States would not remain on the defensive forever. Around noon, the bombers reached their targets. Tokyo, still confident in its security, was caught completely off guard. Air raid sirens wailed, but too late. Doolittle and his squadron dropped their bombs on military factories, industrial complexes, and naval facilities. Explosions rippled across the outskirts of the city, sending thick smoke into the sky and shaking the confidence of a nation that had believed itself untouchable. The Japanese scrambled fighters into the air, but their outdated interceptors struggled to climb fast enough to engage the American bombers, which were already turning south towards China. In some cases, Japanese bullets struck the B-25s but failed to penetrate their reinforced frames. The Americans later claimed to have shot down several interceptors, but in truth, simply surviving the raid was achievement enough. Other bombers attacked Yokohama, striking oil tanks, shipyards, and industrial warehouses. One attack caused major damage to the submarine tender Taigei, which was undergoing conversion into an aircraft carrier. Additional bombers struck Nagoya and Kobe, gathering intelligence on Japanese defenses and industrial capabilities. By the time the Japanese Air Force mobilized in full, the Americans were already vanishing into the distance. But while the bombing was success, the escape was far more dangerous. The early launch meant the bombers would run short on fuel. As they approached the Chinese coastline, night fell, clouds thickened, and rain battered their wings. Several crews were forced to bail out over the rugged Chinese countryside. Others crash-landed in isolated farmland or along rocky hillsides. 3 pilots died in the process, and 8 were captured by Japanese forces occupying parts of China. Only one plane diverted north to the Soviet Union, where its crew was interned for the duration of the war. Still, against all odds, most of the crews survived, thanks in large part to Chinese civilians who risked their lives to shelter and guide them. News of the raid spread across the United States like wildfire. Though the physical damage to Japan was limited, the psychological impact was enormous. Americans celebrated the daring mission as proof that the war was far from lost. Japanese leaders, meanwhile, reacted with shock and humiliation. For the first time, they realized their homeland was vulnerable. Admiral Yamamoto, furious at the failure of Japan's defenses, immediately demanded an expansion of air patrols and an increase in homeland fighter units. Even more consequentially, he pushed harder than ever for his plan to lure the American carrier fleet into a decisive battle near Midway, an operation that would soon change the entire course of the Pacific War.
The aftermath of the Doolittle raid unfolded far beyond the skies of Tokyo. In Japan, the shock was immediate and deeply personal. Ordinary citizens, who had believed in the absolute security of their island nation, watched fires burning in their capital with disbelief. Newspapers struggled to explain how foreign bombers had reached Tokyo undetected. For the Japanese military leadership, the raid was not only an embarrassment, it was a direct challenge to their image of invincibility. Admiral Yamamoto, already concerned about the growing strength of the American Navy, now feared that further raids on the homeland could undermine public confidence and disrupt military planning. His response was swift and uncompromising. Japan would double down on expanding defensive air patrols, reorganize homeland security, and strike a blow so devastating that the Americans would never again dare to challenge Japanese waters. This renewed determination fueled Yamamoto's long-planned operation, a massive offensive aimed at capturing Midway Atoll. To him, Midway was the perfect lure, a location far enough from Japan to appear vulnerable, but close enough to force the US Navy into a desperate attempt to defend it. Yamamoto believed that by drawing out the remaining American aircraft carriers, he could destroy them in a single decisive battle, securing Japan's dominance over the Pacific. But what he didn't fully grasp was how deeply the Doolittle raid had changed American strategy. The audacity of the mission had revitalized the American public and strengthened resolve at the highest levels of command. From now on, the US was no longer reacting, it was preparing to challenge Japanese expansion wherever it appeared. Meanwhile, in China, the consequences of the raid were far more tragic. Knowing that the American bombers had landed or crashed in Chinese territory, Japanese forces launched brutal reprisals across Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces. Entire villages suspected of helping the American crews were burned. Thousands of civilians were killed or executed, and Japanese troops carried out large-scale punitive operations to prevent Chinese participation in future raids. This horrific backlash changed the course of China's war effort and deepened the suffering of civilians already living under occupation. Yet even at such a heavy price, the bravery of the Chinese people ensured that most of the Doolittle raiders survived to return home. Across the Pacific, the raid had an effect that no one, not even Doolittle himself, had fully expected. It jolted the United States into a new phase of determination. Morale soared. Newspapers celebrated the raid as a symbolic turning point, a message that America was still capable of striking at its enemies, despite recent defeats. President Roosevelt famously joked that the bombers had come from Shangri-La, adding to the mystique of the mission. Doolittle, who had privately feared he would be court-martialed for losing all 16 planes, instead received the Medal of Honor. But perhaps the greatest consequence was what happened inside the Japanese Admiralty. Humiliated and pressured to defend the homeland more aggressively, the Japanese shifted critical resources away from ongoing campaigns in New Guinea and the Solomons. Their focus moved towards preparing a large, complex operation, Midway, where they hoped to crush the American carrier force once and for all. This decision, influenced heavily by the shock of the Doolittle raid, would lead Japan directly toward one of the most disastrous defeats in its history. In the end, the Doolittle raid was not about destruction. It was about sending a message. It proved that the United States could and would strike back, even in the darkest days of the war. It ignited new confidence at home, created doubt in Japan, and set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the Pacific War. What began with 16 bombers lifting off from a heaving carrier deck ended by changing the strategic balance of an entire conflict.